first laugh echoed through the ballroom before the groom had even finished adjusting his tie. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it was enough. Within seconds, another guest laughed, then another. Soon, quiet whispers spread from one table to the next as dozens of people exchanged amused glances, convinced they were witnessing the most awkward groom they had ever seen. No one imagined that before the wedding night was over, every person in that room would wish they had never judged him. Because the quiet man standing at the altar wasn't hiding fear, he was hiding the truth. And when that truth was finally revealed, the laughter disappeared forever. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories with unforgettable twists and hidden truths, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Motives. We bring you cinematic, fictional stories that remind us never to judge a book by its cover. Now, let's uncover the secret that changed everything. Grand Windsor Ballroom shimmered beneath magnificent crystal chandeliers, their warm golden light reflecting across polished marble floors and elegant white floral arrangements. More than 300 guests had gathered to celebrate what many described as the wedding of the year. Every table sparkled with fine china and crystal glasses. A live orchestra played softly in the background, while photographers moved from one smiling face to another, capturing what appeared to be the beginning of a perfect evening. At the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, the groom. He wasn't the tallest man in the room, he wasn't the loudest, he wasn't dressed in a designer tuxedo worth thousands of dollars like some of the guests expected. Instead, Daniel wore a perfectly tailored but simple black suit that fit him neatly. His shoes were polished, his hair carefully combed, and his posture reflected quiet confidence. Yet people barely noticed those details. What they noticed was how little he spoke. Throughout the reception, Daniel greeted every guest with a warm smile, a gentle handshake, and only a few polite words before stepping aside. Some interpreted his silence as nervousness, others mistook it for weakness. Several guests assumed he simply wasn't confident enough to belong among the influential families gathered inside the ballroom. At a nearby table, a group of wealthy business associates quietly exchanged amused smiles. "So that's the man Emily chose," one whispered. "He barely says 2 words." Seen accountants with more personality. Soft laughter circled the table, another guest leaned closer. "I heard he owns a small repair shop." "Repair shop?" the others chuckled. "And she's the daughter of one of the city's most respected philanthropists." What was she thinking? Across the room, Daniel's ears caught fragments of the conversation. He heard every word, but he didn't react. Instead, he simply thanked a waiter who offered him a glass of water. Emily Parker watched from a distance. She knew exactly what people were saying. This wasn't the first time. Ever since she announced their engagement, friends, relatives, and even strangers had questioned her decision. She came from a family known throughout the city for its charitable foundation, successful businesses, and elegant public image. Daniel came from somewhere entirely different. He had grown up in a quiet neighborhood with his widowed mother. He never talked about his childhood, never bragged about achievements, never tried to impress anyone. To many people, that silence looked ordinary. To Emily, it was one of the reasons she fell in love with him. She had met Daniel 3 years earlier after her car broke down during a heavy rainstorm on a lonely road outside the city. While dozens of vehicles drove past without stopping, one old pickup truck pulled over. Daniel stepped out carrying nothing more than a small toolbox. He repaired her engine in less than 20 minutes. When she offered to pay him, he smiled. "Use it to help someone else someday." Then he drove away, no business card, no attempt to impress her, no request for her number. She spent weeks trying to find the quiet mechanic who had disappeared into the rain. When she finally located his workshop, she discovered something surprising. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Daniel, not because he was wealthy, but because he quietly repaired elderly neighbors' cars without charging them. He delivered groceries to widows who couldn't leave home. He fixed bicycles for neighborhood children. He sponsored apprentices who couldn't afford vocational training. Yet he never posted any of it online, never accepted awards, never sought recognition. "If people need help," he once told Emily, "they don't need a speech. They need someone willing to show up." Those words stayed with her. Eventually, friendship became love, love became commitment. But convincing everyone else proved almost impossible. Emily's extended family accepted Daniel politely. Some sincerely welcomed him, others tolerated him. A few never bothered hiding their disappointment, especially her uncle Richard. Richard Parker believed success could only be measured by money, influence, and public reputation. He had built one of the region's largest construction companies and rarely missed an opportunity to remind everyone about it. To Richard, Daniel represented failure, not because Daniel lacked character, because he lacked status. As the reception continued, Richard walked confidently through the ballroom greeting politicians, executives, and investors. When he finally reached Daniel, he forced a smile. "Quite a crowd." Daniel nodded politely. "It really is." Richard looked him up and down. "I hope married life motivates you." Daniel smiled. "In what way?" Richard chuckled. "To think bigger. Repair shop is respectable. Emily deserves someone who dreams beyond repairing engines." Several nearby guests laughed quietly. Daniel remained calm. "Appreciate your concern." Richard smirked. "I'm only being honest." He patted Daniel lightly on the shoulder before walking away. The laughter followed him. Emily approached moments later. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her. "For what?" "My family." He smiled gently. "Your family. They'll always matter to you." She lowered her eyes. "I just wish they'd see you the way I do." Daniel took her hand. "One day. They might." Emily smiled. "You always say that, because it's true." Across the ballroom, Daniel's mother quietly watched the exchange. She knew something no one else in that room knew, something Daniel had carried alone for nearly 15 years. a secret he had refused to share because he believed good deeds lost their meaning the moment they became performances. She often begged him to tell people. He always refused. If the truth ever matters, he would say, it will reveal itself. Tonight, that moment was closer than he realized. The orchestra finished another beautiful piece. Guests applauded enthusiastically. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen. His cheerful voice echoed throughout the ballroom. In just a few moments, we'll invite our wonderful bride and groom to share their first dance. Audience applauded again. But first, we've prepared something special. He smiled toward the Parker family. Several family members would like to share a few words. Richard immediately stood, straightened his expensive suit, and confidently walked toward the microphone. Daniel quietly watched him. His expression never changed, but somewhere deep inside, he sensed the evening was about to take a direction no one expected. Richard accepted the microphone with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing every room belonged to him. He raised his champagne glass, smiled broadly, and waited for the applause to fade. Good evening, everyone. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Tonight we're celebrating not only the marriage of my beautiful niece Emily, but also welcoming Daniel into our family. More applause followed. Richard nodded appreciatively, watched Emily grow into an extraordinary woman, intelligent, compassionate, ambitious, the kind of person every parent dreams of raising. Emily smiled politely. Richard turned toward Daniel. Daniel. He paused just long enough for the room to focus on the groom. Well, Daniel certainly surprised us all. Scattered laughter rippled through the audience. Daniel remained still. Richard continued. When Emily first told us she was marrying a mechanic, I'll admit, he laughed. I thought she was joking. Room filled with uneasy chuckles. I asked myself, out of all the successful men who admired her, why choose someone so ordinary? A few guests laughed louder. Emily's smile disappeared. Her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Richard raised a hand dramatically. But then I realized, maybe that's the beauty of love. Doesn't always make sense. Another round of laughter echoed through the ballroom. Daniel's mother lowered her eyes. She had heard enough. Emily stood from her chair. Uncle Richard. He gently waved her back. I'm almost finished. Turning once again toward Daniel, he smiled with false warmth. Marriage is expensive, so here's a little advice. Bigger. Maybe one day you'll own 2 repair shops. This time the laughter was louder than before. Even a few people who hadn't intended to laugh found themselves smiling awkwardly, not because the joke was especially funny, but because everyone else seemed to be laughing. Daniel simply folded his hands in front of him. His expression remained calm. Richard took one final sip from his glass. To the happy couple, he raised it high. Into hopping, our groom eventually learns that ambition is just as important as kindness. Applause mixed with scattered laughter. Richard proudly returned to his seat. Emily immediately walked toward Daniel. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have stopped him. Daniel gently squeezed her hand. You have nothing to apologize for. He humiliated you. Daniel smiled softly. No, revealed something about himself. About me. Emily looked into his eyes. She had always admired that about him. No matter how harsh the situation became, Daniel never answered cruelty with cruelty. The master of ceremonies sensed the uncomfortable atmosphere. Trying to recover the mood, he forced an enthusiastic smile. Well, let's move on to our groom. Sure, Daniel has prepared a few words. Several guests exchanged amused looks. One whispered, this should be interesting. Another quietly laughed. I hope he actually speaks. The microphone was handed to Daniel. He walked slowly onto the stage. The ballroom became surprisingly quiet. Daniel looked around the room. He recognized many familiar faces: neighbors, old teachers, customers from his workshop, business executives, politicians, people who admired him, people who doubted him, people who had laughed only moments earlier. He smiled warmly. First, I want to thank every single person here. Whether you came from across the street or across the country, your presence means more than you know. Audience applauded politely. Daniel continued. When people hear very little from someone, they often assume that person has nothing to say. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Never believe the loudest voice is the strongest. My mother taught me something when I was a boy. He glanced toward her. She smiled proudly through moist eyes. She told me, if your character is genuine, you won't need to advertise it. Daniel paused. Tried to live by those words every day. He looked toward Richard, and tonight, been given a reason to finally explain why. Room fell silent. Richard leaned back confidently, still convinced nothing Daniel could say would matter. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his suit, not for revenge, not for anger, but for an old, slightly worn envelope. Its edges had yellowed with age. He held it gently. This envelope changed my life. Curiosity spread through the ballroom. It also changed someone else's life, though they never knew it. Emily watched him with confusion. She had never seen the envelope before. Daniel carefully unfolded a faded newspaper clipping. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but everyone could recognize the front page. The headline described a devastating factory fire that had occurred 15 years earlier. Many guests looked puzzled. Daniel spoke quietly. When I was 17. My father worked in this factory. Didn't survive. Ballroom grew still. Daniel continued. That same day, then 40 workers made it home alive. He looked toward the audience. My father didn't. Nobody moved. My father went back inside after escaping. To save equipment. For money. Went back because several younger workers were trapped. His voice remained steady. He rescued every one of them. The building collapsed before he could escape. A heavy silence settled across the room. Daniel looked down at the newspaper. People called him a hero. I agreed. I also watched my mother lose everything. Savings disappeared. The house was sold. My mother worked 3 jobs. I left school for a while. I became a mechanic because it was the fastest way to help put food on our table. He smiled gently. Never been ashamed of that. Several guests quietly lowered their eyes. Daniel folded the newspaper clipping. For years, I believed that was simply life, until one afternoon. My mother told me something she'd hidden since the funeral. He slowly opened the old envelope. Inside was another document, a handwritten letter. My father had received an offer from a wealthy businessman. The businessman wanted him to become the maintenance director for a new company. It would have changed our lives. Was supposed to sign the contract the morning after the fire. Room remained completely silent. My father never made that meeting. Daniel looked around the ballroom. So the businessman quietly created a scholarship fund for children of factory workers. Also anonymously helped several families recover. Daniel smiled. My mother always wondered who he was. Never found out. Until 3 months ago, Emily's eyes widened. What? She whispered. Daniel nodded gently. I finally discovered his identity. Every person in the ballroom leaned forward. Even Richard's confident smile had begun to fade. Daniel slowly turned his gaze toward the Parker family and finally, toward Richard himself. Richard frowned for the first time that evening. He looked genuinely uncertain. Daniel took a slow breath and spoke words that left the ballroom holding its breath. Man who gave my family hope was someone sitting in this room tonight. Every eye in the ballroom instinctively turned toward Richard. Richard sat a little straighter, almost expecting the room to applaud him. A faint smile crept across his face. For a brief moment, he seemed ready to accept credit for a kindness he had never claimed. Daniel noticed the expression and gently shook his head. I'm sorry, he said quietly. It's not Richard. The smile vanished. A wave of confused whispers swept through the guests. If it wasn't Richard, then who was it? Daniel slowly turned toward the far end of the head table. A silver-haired man in a simple dark suit looked up in surprise. It was Emily's father, Charles Parker. Unlike Richard, Charles had spent most of the evening avoiding attention, content to let others speak while he quietly greeted guests. Daniel smiled warmly. It was you? Charles' eyes widened. No, he whispered. You weren't supposed to know. Ballroom fell silent. Emily stared at her father in disbelief. Dad. Charles slowly stood for several seconds. He couldn't find the words. Finally, he took a deep breath. Your father and I worked together. Gasps echoed around the room. I was one of the young men trapped inside that factory. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Charles continued, his voice trembling. I was 24 years old. I had a wife and a baby girl waiting for me at home. He looked at Emily with tear-filled eyes. That baby girl was you? Emily covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Smoke was so thick I couldn't even see my own hands. Charles continued. I had accepted that I wasn't getting out. Then your father came back. Could have walked away, had already escaped. He chose to return, found us, led us toward an emergency exit. Charles paused, struggling to continue. I was the last person he pushed through that doorway. The roof collapsed seconds later. Ballroom was completely silent. Not a single glass clinked, not a chair moved. Charles wiped away a tear. I spent years trying to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. I searched for your family. By the time I found you, your mother had already moved. I respected her wish for privacy, so I chose another way. He smiled gently at Daniel's mother. Scholarship fund, anonymous donations, the repairs on your workshop when it nearly closed, the equipment that mysteriously arrived one Christmas morning. Daniel's mother began to cry softly. It was you. Charles nodded. I promised myself I would never tell anyone. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was simply honoring the man who saved my life. Emily looked back and forth between the two men. So, she whispered through tears. Reason we met? Daniel smiled. Was because your father unknowingly spent years helping the family of the man who saved him. A quiet murmur of amazement spread through the room. Richard lowered his head. For the first time all evening he looked genuinely ashamed. He slowly walked toward the stage. The confident businessman who had mocked Daniel only minutes earlier seemed completely transformed. He stopped a few feet away. Owe you an apology. Daniel remained silent. Richard looked around the ballroom before speaking again. I judged you by your job. I judged you by your income. I judged you because you didn't feel the need to impress anyone. He swallowed hard and tonight realized the poorest person in this room wasn't the mechanic, was me. Room remained quiet. Richard turned to the guests. Many of you laughed because I laughed. I made kindness look small. I made humility seem like weakness. He faced Daniel once more. I'm sorry, truly am. Daniel stepped forward. For a moment. Everyone expected him to deliver a speech that would make Richard feel even smaller. Instead, he extended his hand. Richard looked at it in disbelief. You don't owe me your respect anymore, Daniel said softly. But if this moment helps us judge people less by their status and more by their character, then tonight wasn't wasted. Richard slowly shook his hand. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes. Without anyone asking, the ballroom erupted into heartfelt applause. This time it wasn't polite, it wasn't forced, it was filled with genuine admiration. The laughter that had echoed through the room earlier was gone, replaced by something far more meaningful: respect. The master of ceremonies smiled through watery eyes. Hosted weddings for nearly 20 years. Never witnessed anything like this. Neither had anyone else. Daniel picked up the microphone one final time. Spent most of my life believing good deeds don't need an audience. I still believe that. He smiled toward Charles. But sometimes, a story isn't shared to make someone look important. It shared to remind us that one act of courage can change generations. He looked around the ballroom. If this story touched your heart and you enjoy fictional stories with powerful twists and meaningful lessons, subscribe to Hidden Motives. There are many more unforgettable stories waiting for you. Orchestra quietly began to play again. This time the music felt different, warmer, lighter. Daniel walked back to Emily. She wrapped her arms around him without saying a word. She didn't need to. Everything she felt was written in the tears on her face. As they stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance, every guest rose to their feet not because tradition demanded it, but because they wanted to honor a man whose greatest strength had never been his voice. It had always been his character. Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest stories. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never feels the need to prove it. And sometimes the greatest legacy isn't measured by wealth, titles, or applause, but by the lives forever changed through a single selfless act. As the evening came to a close, the untouched laughter of the beginning had become something entirely different. It had become a lesson. Never mistake humility for weakness. Never confuse silence with emptiness. And never judge someone's worth before you know their story. Now we'd love to hear from you. If you had been one of the guests at that wedding, would you have had the courage to apologize after learning the truth? Or do you think first impressions are too difficult to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to read every perspective.